The morning sun cast long shadows across the Chen family farm as Marcus knelt beside a row of tomato plants, his weathered hands gently examining the leaves for signs of pest damage. The soil beneath his knees was still cool from the night, rich and dark from years of careful cultivation. His daughter Lily sat cross-legged nearby, sketching the barn cats in her notebook while humming a tune she had learned in school. Marcus had been awake since 4:30, as he was every morning, checking the irrigation systems and walking the fields before the heat of the day set in. The farm was modest by most standards, just 12 acres of vegetables and a small orchard, but it was theirs. Every plant, every furrow, every fence post represented years of backbreaking work and careful planning. The sound of gravel crunching under small feet made him look up from the tomato plants. A boy was walking up the dirt road that led to their farmhouse, his clothes dusty and his shoulders hunched with exhaustion. Marcus estimated the child to be around 10 years old, thin and dark-haired, with eyes that held too much worry for someone so young. Lily noticed the visitor too and stopped her sketching. The boy approached hesitantly, his gaze darting between Marcus and the farmhouse as if he was unsure whether he should continue or turn around and run back the way he had come. Marcus stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his jeans, and waited. He had learned over the years that rushing toward frightened children only made them more likely to bolt. Instead, he remained still and let the boy come to him at his own pace. When the child was close enough that they could speak without shouting, he stopped and looked directly at Marcus with an intensity that was startling. His small hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and Marcus could see that he had been crying recently. The boy took a shaky breath and said, "My name is Tommy Rodriguez. My grandmother sent me to ask if you might help us. She said you were the only farmer in the county who might know what to do." Marcus felt his heart tighten at the desperation in the child's voice. He glanced at Lily, who had moved closer, her sketch pad forgotten on the ground. She was listening with the same intensity that she brought to everything, her dark eyes wide with concern for this stranger who had appeared at their farm. "What kind of help does your grandmother need, Tommy?" Marcus asked gently, keeping his voice soft and steady. "Our crops are dying," Tommy said, and the words seemed to pour out of him all at once. "The corn and the beans and everything. There are these spots on the leaves and they keep getting bigger and bigger. Grandmother says if we lose the harvest we will lose the farm too. She is sick with worry and I do not know what to do." The boy's voice cracked on the last words, and Marcus saw him struggle to maintain his composure. It was clear that this child had already tried other options before coming here, and Marcus wondered how many doors had been closed to him, how many adults had dismissed his concerns or turned him away. "Where in the world are you watching from right now?" Marcus thought to himself, remembering how his own grandfather had once told him that every person who came seeking help deserved to be heard, no matter how young or how desperate they might seem. Have you ever seen someone underestimated because of their circumstances? Marcus walked closer to Tommy, moving slowly so as not to startle him. When he was near enough, he knelt down so that he was at the boy's eye level, a gesture that his own father had taught him when dealing with frightened animals or worried children. "Tell me about these spots on the leaves," Marcus said. "What do they look like? Are they brown or black or some other color? Do they have any kind of pattern to them?" Tommy's eyes lit up with surprise and relief that someone was actually listening to him, actually asking detailed questions instead of dismissing his concerns. "They start small and yellow," he said, using his hands to demonstrate the size. "Then they get bigger and turn brown in the middle with a yellow ring around the outside. And they smell funny, kind of sweet but wrong." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, already forming hypotheses about what might be affecting the Rodriguez family crops. The description sounded like one of several possible fungal diseases, but he would need to see the plants himself to make an accurate diagnosis. More importantly, he could see that this boy had been observant and careful in his description, which suggested that his grandmother had taught him to pay attention to details. "How far is your grandmother's farm from here?" Marcus asked. "About 3 miles down the valley road," Tommy said. "Past the old Miller place and over the creek bridge. She has been farming there for 40 years, ever since she and my grandfather bought the land. She knows everything about growing things, but this time she says the plants are sick with something she has never seen before. Marcus stood up and brushed the dust from his knees. Lily had moved closer during the conversation, and he could see that she was as concerned about Tommy as he was. She had always been sensitive to the emotions of others, even as a very young child, and he could tell that Tommy's distress was affecting her deeply. "Tommy," Marcus said, "I would like to come and look at your grandmother's crops this afternoon if that would be all right with her. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can spot things that are easy to miss when you are worried and looking at the same problem every day." The transformation in Tommy's face was immediate and dramatic. His shoulders straightened, his eyes brightened, and for the first time since he had appeared on their farm, he looked like the child he was instead of someone carrying the weight of adult responsibilities. "You would really come?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with disbelief and hope. "Even though we cannot pay you anything right now. Grandmother says maybe after the harvest if there is a harvest." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced years ago when he had first begun to understand how many people were struggling, how many families were one bad harvest away from losing everything they had worked for. He thought about his own comfortable savings account, built up from years of careful farming and frugal living, and about the knowledge he carried that most people in the county had no idea he possessed. "Tommy," he said firmly, "there is no charge for neighbors helping neighbors. That is not how things work around here." The boy's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than desperation. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and tried to smile, though his lips were still trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," he whispered. "Thank you so much. I will run home right now and tell grandmother that you are coming. She will be so happy. She has been praying for help and now here you are." Before Marcus could respond, Tommy turned and began jogging back down the dirt road, his earlier exhaustion seemingly forgotten in his eagerness to share the good news with his grandmother. Marcus and Lily watched until he disappeared around the bend, and then they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "Daddy," Lily said finally, "are we really going to help them?" Marcus looked down at his daughter, seeing his own compassion reflected in her young face. "Of course we are, sweetheart. That is what we do when people need help. We help them." As they walked back toward the farmhouse together, Marcus found himself thinking about the challenge that lay ahead. He had recognized the symptoms that Tommy had described, and if he was right about the diagnosis, the Rodriguez family was facing a serious fungal infection that could indeed destroy their entire harvest. The standard treatments recommended by the County Agricultural Extension Office would be expensive and might not even be effective against this particular strain. But Marcus had other options, knowledge and techniques that he had learned during his years as a professor of agricultural science before his life had taken a different turn. He had spent decades researching sustainable and innovative approaches to crop diseases, developing methods that were both more effective and more environmentally friendly than conventional treatments. The question was whether he was ready to reveal that knowledge, and whether the community would be willing to listen to advice from someone they saw as just another small-scale farmer rather than the expert he had once been. The afternoon heat shimmered off the asphalt as Marcus drove his old pickup truck down the valley road toward the Rodriguez farm. Lily sat beside him in the passenger seat, her small backpack filled with colored pencils and paper in case she got bored while he examined the crops. She had insisted on coming along, telling him that Tommy might need a friend his own age while the adults talked about serious things. The Miller place that Tommy had mentioned was indeed abandoned, its broken windows and sagging porch a stark reminder of how quickly a farm could fail without proper care or adequate resources. Marcus slowed the truck as they approached the creek bridge, noting the way the wooden planks rattled under their weight and making a mental note to mention to someone that the structure probably needed maintenance. The Rodriguez farm appeared around the next bend, a small cluster of buildings surrounded by fields that should have been green and thriving at this time of year. Instead, Marcus could see even from the road that something was seriously wrong with the crops. The corn stalks stood at uneven heights, many of them showing the telltale brown and yellow discoloration that Tommy had described. The bean plants looked even worse, their leaves curled and spotted, hanging limp despite the adequate moisture in the soil. Marcus parked the truck beside a modest farmhouse that had been painted white sometime in the distant past but now showed the weathered gray of wood that had endured too many seasons without fresh paint. The front porch was swept clean, and flower boxes under the windows held bright marigolds that provided the only splash of vibrant color in an otherwise struggling landscape. Tommy appeared from behind the house before Marcus had even turned off the engine, running toward them with the same urgency he had shown that morning. Behind him walked an elderly woman who moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints ached but whose spirit remained strong. She wore a faded blue dress and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen many seasons of fieldwork. "Mr. Chen," Tommy called out, "you came just like you promised." "Grandmother, this is the farmer I told you about." The woman approached with dignity despite her obvious worry, extending a work-worn hand to Marcus as he stepped out of the truck. She was shorter than he had expected, but her grip was firm and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent decades observing and learning from the natural world. "I am Maria Rodriguez," she said, "and I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you would take time from your own work to help us. Tommy says you asked good questions about the plant disease, which gives me hope that you might know something the other people we have talked to did not." Marcus introduced Lily, who shook Mrs. Rodriguez's hand with the same serious politeness she showed to all adults, and then the four of them walked together toward the affected fields. As they got closer to the crops, Marcus could smell the sweet, slightly rotten odor that Tommy had mentioned, and his suspicions about the nature of the disease began to solidify. The damage was extensive, worse than he had hoped but not worse than he had feared. The fungal infection had spread through most of the corn and bean plants, creating the characteristic Bolsea pattern of yellowing and browning that indicated a particularly aggressive strain. What concerned him most was that the infection seemed to be affecting multiple crop species simultaneously, which suggested either a very adaptable pathogen or possibly multiple diseases working in combination. Mrs. Rodriguez walked beside him as he examined the plants, her weathered hands gently touching the damaged leaves as she explained what she had observed over the past several weeks. She had tried the standard fungicide treatments recommended by the county extension office, she told him, but they had seemed to make little difference. The disease continued to spread despite her efforts. "Have you had any visitors from the agricultural department?" Marcus asked as he knelt beside a particularly affected corn plant and carefully examined the roots as well as the visible portions. "Oh yes," Mrs. Rodriguez said with a slight edge to her voice. "A young man came out here last week. Very official looking with his clipboard and his fancy truck. He took one look at the crops and told me I should have called him sooner, that there was probably nothing to be done at this point except to plow everything under and hope for better luck next year." Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the casual dismissal this woman had received from someone who was supposed to be helping farmers in situations exactly like this one. He had encountered that kind of attitude too many times during his academic career, the assumption that small-scale farmers lacked the knowledge or resources to implement sophisticated solutions. "Did he take any soil samples or plant samples for testing?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He said it would be a waste of time and money," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "He said I should focus on planning what to plant next year instead of trying to save crops that were already too far gone." Marcus stood up slowly, brushing the soil from his hands, and looked out across the damaged fields with new understanding. This was not just a case of plant disease, it was a case of agricultural prejudice, the assumption that certain farmers were not worth the effort of proper diagnosis and treatment. Lily had been playing with Tommy near the edge of the field, but now she approached with the serious expression she wore when she had been thinking hard about something important. "Daddy," she said quietly, "can you really help Mrs. Rodriguez's plants get better?" Marcus looked down at his daughter, seeing in her face the same concern for justice and fairness that he hoped he was modeling for her every day. The honest answer was that he believed he could help, but it would require revealing knowledge and techniques that would definitely raise questions about his background and qualifications. "I think so, sweetheart," he said finally. "It will take some work and some time, but I think these plants can be saved." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at him with surprise and hope. "Really, Mr. Chen? You think there is still a chance?" Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the treatment protocol he would need to implement. The disease was serious, but it was not hopeless. With the right combination of organic soil amendments, targeted biological controls, and careful irrigation management, he was confident that the infection could be stopped and the plants could recover enough to produce a decent harvest. The question was whether he was ready to take on not just the agricultural challenge, but the social and political challenges that would inevitably follow when word got out that a small-scale farmer was contradicting the official recommendations of the county agricultural department. Marcus returned to the Rodriguez farm 3 days later with his truck loaded with supplies that had taken him hours to gather from various sources around the county. Bags of specialized compost, containers of beneficial bacteria cultures, and several pieces of equipment that most small farmers would never think to use filled the truck bed. He had spent the previous evening explaining to Lily why he needed to help their neighbors, and she had listened with the serious attention she gave to all matters of fairness and kindness. Mrs. Rodriguez met him at the gate, her face showing a mixture of hope and bewilderment as she watched him unload materials she did not recognize. Tommy was beside her, practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of seeing his grandmother's farm saved by what he was already calling miracle treatments. "What is all this, Mr. Chen?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked as Marcus carried the first bag of specialized compost toward the affected fields. "I have never seen materials like these at the feed store or the agricultural supply company." Marcus set down the bag and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "These are some organic amendments that should help restore the natural balance in your soil," he explained carefully. "The disease that is affecting your crops thrives in certain chemical conditions, but if we can change those conditions, we can stop the spread and help the plants recover." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly, though Marcus could see that she was still puzzled by the scientific terminology he was using. She had farmed for 40 years using traditional methods and conventional wisdom, and his approach was unlike anything she had encountered before. As Marcus began applying the soil amendments, following a precise pattern based on his analysis of the infection distribution, he became aware that they had attracted an audience. 2 neighboring farmers had noticed the unusual activity and had walked over to see what was happening. Marcus recognized them as the Jenkins brothers, whose family had farmed in the valley for 3 generations. "Morning, Marcus," called out the older brother, whose name was Bill. "What are you doing over here with all that fancy equipment?" Marcus straightened up and nodded politely to both men. "Just trying to help Mrs. Rodriguez with her crop disease problem," he said simply. The younger brother, whose name was Pete, laughed and shook his head. "Marcus, you are a decent enough farmer for a small operation, but this looks like some kind of experimental nonsense. Mrs. Rodriguez, you should not be wasting your time with unproven treatments when the Agricultural Extension Office has already told you what needs to be done." Mrs. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the criticism, but Tommy stepped forward with the fierce loyalty that children sometimes show toward adults who have shown them kindness. "Mr. Chen knows what he is doing," Tommy said firmly. "He asked better questions about our plants than anyone else who has come here." Pete Jenkins smiled condescendingly at the boy. "Son, farming is not about asking questions. It is about following proven methods that have worked for generations. Your grandmother would be better off taking the advice of trained professionals instead of listening to amateur theories." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had encountered this attitude many times during his academic career, the assumption that practical experience was the only valid form of agricultural knowledge. He continued working with the soil amendments, carefully measuring and applying the materials according to the precise formula he had calculated. Bill Jenkins walked closer to examine what Marcus was doing, his expression growing more skeptical with each passing moment. "Marcus, I have been farming in this valley for 30 years, and I have never seen anyone put this kind of stuff on their fields. Where did you even get these materials, and how do you know they will not make the problem worse instead of better?" Marcus paused in his work and looked directly at both brothers. "These treatments are based on biological principles that address the root causes of fungal diseases rather than just the symptoms," he said. "The materials are available from specialty agricultural suppliers, and the application methods are designed to restore natural soil health." Pete Jenkins snorted with amusement. "Biological principles," he repeated mockingly. "Marcus, You sound like one of those college professors who thinks they know more about farming than actual farmers do. Mrs. Rodriguez, you should be careful about letting someone experiment on your crops when you cannot afford to lose what little harvest you might still be able to save. Mrs. Rodriguez looked back and forth between Marcus and the Jenkins brothers, clearly torn between her desperation for help and her fear of making a costly mistake. Marcus could see the doubt beginning to creep into her expression, and he felt a familiar frustration at the way his knowledge was being dismissed without consideration. Tommy, however, was not willing to let the criticism go unchallenged. These men did not even ask to see our plants before they decided Mr. Chen was wrong, he said with the startling directness that children sometimes display. Mr. Chen spent an hour looking at everything and asking grandmother questions about what she had observed. They just came over here to tell us we are making a mistake. Bill Jenkins looked surprised at being challenged by a 10-year-old boy, but Pete laughed again. Son, we do not need to look at the plants because we already know what the agricultural inspector told your grandmother. Sometimes crops fail, and the best thing to do is accept it and plan for next year. Marcus finished applying the soil amendment to the section he had been working on and stood up slowly. The Jenkins brothers were not malicious, he realized, just limited in their understanding of what was possible when conventional approaches failed. They represented the kind of thinking that had frustrated him throughout his academic career, the assumption that innovation was dangerous and that expertise could only come from traditional sources. Mrs. Rodriguez finally spoke, her voice quiet but determined. Mr. Chen has been the only person who offered to help us without asking for payment, she said. The agricultural inspector told us to give up, and you are telling us to give up. At least Mr. Chen is trying to save our crops. Pete Jenkins shrugged and began walking back toward his own farm. Suit yourself, Mrs. Rodriguez. But when this experimental treatment fails and you lose everything, do not say we did not warn you. After the brothers had left, Mrs. Rodriguez and Tommy helped Marcus continue applying the treatments, though Marcus could sense the elderly woman's continued uncertainty about the unconventional methods he was using. As they worked together in the afternoon heat, he found himself wondering whether he should reveal more about his background in order to reassure her, or whether that would create even more complications in a community that was clearly suspicious of outside expertise. 2 weeks after Marcus had begun his treatment protocol, the first signs of improvement were becoming visible in the Rodriguez fields. The characteristic sweet smell of decay had diminished noticeably, and several of the corn plants were showing new green growth where the brown spots had previously been spreading. Tommy had taken to checking the plants every morning before school, measuring their progress with a ruler and keeping careful notes in a composition notebook that his grandmother had given him for the project. Marcus was examining the soil pH levels near the bean plants when a white county truck pulled into the Rodriguez driveway, its official seal clearly visible on the door panels. A young man in a crisp uniform shirt stepped out, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who was not pleased about having to make this particular visit. Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from her house and walked toward the truck with visible apprehension. Tommy appeared from behind the barn where he had been feeding the chickens, and Marcus could see the boy's jaw set with determination as he recognized the agricultural inspector who had dismissed their concerns weeks earlier. The inspector looked around the farm with obvious disapproval, his gaze settling on the bags of soil amendments that Marcus had stacked near the field entrance. He made several notes on his clipboard before addressing Mrs. Rodriguez with the tone of authority that government officials sometimes adopt when dealing with people they consider beneath their expertise. Mrs. Rodriguez, I am David Harrison from the County Agricultural Extension Office, he said formally. I have received reports that you are using unauthorized treatments on your crops despite my previous recommendations. I need to inspect what has been done here and determine whether any regulations have been violated. Mrs. Rodriguez glanced nervously at Marcus, who straightened up from his soil testing and walked over to join the conversation. Mr. Harrison, she said carefully, this is Marcus Chen, the farmer who has been helping us try to save our harvest. Harrison looked Marcus up and down with barely concealed disdain. Mr. Chen, I understand you have been applying experimental treatments to these crops without proper authorization or oversight. Are you aware that unauthorized use of agricultural chemicals can result in significant fines and penalties? Marcus felt his temper beginning to rise, but he forced himself to remain calm and professional. "All of the materials I have used are certified organic and approved for agricultural use," he replied evenly. "I can provide documentation for everything if you would like to review it." Harrison made another note on his clipboard. "The issue is not whether the materials are approved, Mr. Chen. The issue is that you are not a certified agricultural consultant or extension agent, which means you are not qualified to diagnose crop diseases or recommend treatment protocols." Tommy stepped forward with the fearless indignation that children sometimes display in the face of adult injustice. "Mr. Chen knows more about our plants than you do," he said boldly. "You told us to give up, but he is helping them get better. Look at the corn plants over there if you do not believe me." Harrison glanced dismissively toward the field without actually examining the plants that Tommy was pointing out. "Son, I appreciate your loyalty to Mr. Chen, but agricultural science is more complicated than it might appear. Sometimes well-meaning people can cause more harm than good when they interfere with professional recommendations." Marcus walked over to the nearest corn plant and carefully lifted one of the lower leaves to show the new growth that had appeared over the past week. "Mr. Harrison," he said quietly, "would you be willing to examine the actual progress that has been made here before you make your final assessment?" Harrison reluctantly approached the plant that Marcus was indicating, his expression suggesting that he was merely humoring what he considered to be amateur enthusiasm. But as he looked more closely at the leaf structure and the obvious signs of recovery, his confident dismissal began to give way to puzzled uncertainty. "This does appear to show some improvement," he admitted grudgingly. "But without proper soil testing and laboratory analysis, there is no way to determine whether this is due to your treatments or simply natural recovery that would have occurred anyway." Marcus reached into his equipment bag and pulled out a folder containing detailed pH readings, soil composition analyses, and photographic documentation of the plants at various stages of treatment. He handed the folder to Harrison with the same calm professionalism he had once used when presenting research findings to academic committees. "Here are the soil tests and progress documentation," Marcus said simply. "I think you will find that the improvements correlate directly with the treatment applications and cannot be explained by natural recovery patterns." Harrison opened the folder and began examining the contents, his expression growing more confused with each page he reviewed. The documentation was far more thorough and scientifically rigorous than anything he had expected from a small-scale farmer, and the treatment methodology showed a level of sophistication that he had not encountered before. "Mr. Chen," Harrison said slowly, "where exactly did you obtain this level of expertise in agricultural science? This documentation suggests training and knowledge that goes well beyond typical farming experience." Marcus felt the familiar moment of decision that he had been anticipating since he first agreed to help the Rodriguez family. He could continue to deflect questions about his background, or he could reveal enough of the truth to establish his credibility. The choice would determine not only whether his treatment of the Rodriguez crops would be allowed to continue, but also how the community would view him going forward. "I have some background in agricultural research," Marcus said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "I believe the treatments I have implemented here are both safe and effective, and the documentation should support that assessment." Harrison studied Marcus with new interest, clearly sensing that there was more to his story than had been initially apparent. Mrs. Rodriguez looked back and forth between the two men, beginning to understand that the farmer who had offered to help her family might possess knowledge and credentials that he had not previously revealed. Tommy, meanwhile, was watching the entire exchange with the intense focus he brought to everything that affected his grandmother's welfare, and Marcus could see in the boy's expression both protective loyalty and growing curiosity about what other surprises his new ally might be hiding. Word of the unusual activity at the Rodriguez farm spread through the valley community with the speed that gossip travels in small agricultural towns. By the following week, several neighbors had found excuses to drive past the farm to see for themselves whether the experimental treatments were actually working. The Jenkins brothers had told everyone at the feed store about the strange materials Marcus was using, and their skepticism had taken on an edge of resentment as reports filtered back about the visible improvement in the Rodriguez crops. Marcus was acutely aware of the attention his work was attracting, and he found himself wondering whether he had made a mistake in choosing to help so publicly. During his years as a professor, he had published research in academic journals that were read by perhaps a few hundred specialists worldwide. Now his agricultural innovations were being scrutinized by an entire community of people who had strong opinions about farming methods and who were not particularly impressed by scientific credentials. The situation came to a head on a Thursday morning when Marcus arrived at the Rodriguez farm to find 3 vehicles parked in the driveway. In addition to Mrs. Rodriguez and Tommy, there was David Harrison, the agricultural inspector, Bill Jenkins representing the local Farmers Association, and a woman Marcus did not recognize who wore the kind of professional attire that suggested government authority. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Marcus as he stepped out of his truck, her face showing the strain of being caught in the middle of a conflict she did not fully understand. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "these people want to ask you some questions about the treatments you have been using. I told them you were coming this morning." The woman in professional attire stepped forward and extended her hand with the confident manner of someone accustomed to taking charge of situations. "I am Janet Morrison from the State Agricultural Department," she said. "I understand you have been implementing some innovative disease management protocols here. We would like to discuss your methodology and credentials." Marcus shook her hand and nodded politely, while internally preparing himself for the kind of interrogation he had hoped to avoid. Behind Morrison, he could see Harrison checking items off on his ever-present clipboard, and Bill Jenkins wore the satisfied expression of someone who expected to witness the exposure of a fraud. "What part of Marcus's quiet determination resonates with you?" he thought to himself, remembering his grandfather's advice about standing firm in the face of opposition when you know you are doing the right thing. Share your thoughts about times when hidden expertise has been challenged by established authority. "Mr. Chen," Morrison began, "I have reviewed the documentation that Mr. Harrison collected last week, and I must say it represents a level of scientific rigor that is unusual for on-farm research. Could you explain how you developed this particular treatment protocol?" Marcus glanced at Tommy, who was listening intently from beside his grandmother, and at Mrs. Rodriguez, whose worried expression reminded him that this conversation would determine whether his treatment program would be allowed to continue. The honest answer to Morrison's question would require revealing far more about his background than he had intended, but evasion was no longer a viable option. "The protocol is based on integrated pest management principles combined with soil microbiome restoration techniques," Marcus said carefully. "The specific application rates and timing were calculated based on soil analysis and disease progression patterns that I documented over several weeks of observation." Morrison made notes as he spoke, but her expression suggested that his answer had raised more questions than it had resolved. "Mr. Chen," she said, "the methodology you describe requires graduate-level training in agricultural science and access to laboratory facilities for proper soil analysis. Most farmers in this county rely on the Extension Office for that level of technical support." Bill Jenkins stepped forward with the impatient manner of someone who felt that too much time was being wasted on unnecessary complications. "Janet, with all due respect, I think we are overcomplicating this situation. Marcus is a decent enough small farmer, but he is not qualified to be experimenting with untested treatments on someone else's crops. Mrs. Rodriguez should be following standard recommendations instead of risking her harvest on amateur theories." Tommy suddenly spoke up with the clear voice of a child who had reached the limit of his patience with adult politics. "Mr. Jenkins," he said firmly, "have you actually looked at our plants since Mr. Chen started helping us? Because they are getting better every day, and that is more than anyone else was able to do for us." Morrison looked at Tommy with surprise, clearly not expecting to receive agricultural opinions from a 10-year-old boy. She walked over to the nearest section of treated crops and began examining them with the systematic approach of someone trained in plant pathology. After several minutes of careful observation, she straightened up with an expression of genuine puzzlement. "Mr. Chen," Morrison said slowly, "I have to admit that these plants show remarkable recovery from what appears to have been a severe fungal infection. The new growth patterns and the reduction in disease symptoms are quite impressive. However, I am still concerned about the lack of proper oversight and documentation of the treatment process." Marcus felt the familiar tension between his desire to help and his reluctance to expose himself to the scrutiny that would inevitably follow if he revealed his true qualifications. He had left his academic career behind for reasons that seemed important at the time, but now he was facing a situation where his knowledge could make the difference between success and failure for a family that desperately needed help. "Mrs. Morrison," Marcus said finally, "I understand your concerns about proper procedures and oversight. What I would like to propose is that we continue the current treatment protocol while documenting everything according to whatever standards you feel are appropriate. If the results continue to be positive, then we can discuss the broader implications. If the treatments prove ineffective, then Mrs. Rodriguez can pursue other options with minimal additional risk to her crops." Morrison considered his proposal while Harrison continued taking notes and Bill Jenkins shook his head with obvious disapproval. Tommy watched the adult conversation with the intense focus of someone whose family's future depended on the outcome, and Mrs. Rodriguez stood quietly beside her grandson, waiting to learn whether the help she had finally found would be taken away from her. Janet Morrison's decision to allow the treatment program to continue under official observation brought an unexpected consequence that Marcus had not anticipated. Within days of her visit, news of the Rodriguez farm situation had spread beyond the local community and attracted the attention of agricultural professionals from across the region. Morrison had filed a preliminary report about the innovative treatment methods, and word had reached colleagues at the state university who were intrigued by the sophisticated approach being used by an apparently self-taught farmer. Marcus discovered the extent of the outside interest when he arrived at the Rodriguez farm the following Monday to find 2 additional vehicles parked alongside Morrison's official car. A man and woman in university polo shirts were examining the treated crops with professional measuring equipment, while Morrison stood nearby taking photographs and making detailed notes about plant recovery rates. Mrs. Rodriguez met Marcus at his truck with an expression that mixed pride and bewilderment. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "these professors came from the state university to see what you have done here. They say they have never seen recovery like this from such a severe fungal infection." The university representatives introduced themselves as Dr. Sarah Kim from the Plant Pathology Department and Dr. Robert Torres from Soil Science. Both were clearly impressed by what they were observing, but their questions about methodology and theoretical framework made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable as he tried to provide explanations without revealing the full extent of his academic background. Dr. Kim was particularly persistent in her inquiries about the specific biological mechanisms underlying the treatment approach. "Mr. Chen," she said as they examined a section of corn plants that showed dramatic improvement, "the precision of your soil amendment calculations suggests familiarity with advanced agricultural chemistry. Have you worked with university extension programs or agricultural research facilities?" Marcus felt the familiar pressure of being caught between honesty and self-protection. The success of his treatment program was becoming impossible to dismiss as luck or intuition, and his attempts to deflect questions about his qualifications were starting to sound evasive rather than modest. "I have done quite a bit of reading about sustainable agricultural practices over the years," Marcus said carefully. "Much of the information is available through academic publications if you know where to look for it." Dr. Torres laughed with the knowing amusement of someone who spent his professional life working with complex agricultural science. "Mr. Chen, with respect, the treatment protocol you have implemented here goes well beyond what could be learned from casual reading. The integration of multiple biological control agents with precisely timed soil chemistry modifications requires the kind of systematic understanding that typically comes from graduate-level training and Hansen research experience." Tommy had been listening to the conversation from his position near the edge of the group, and Marcus could see the boy's growing frustration with the adults who seemed more interested in questioning Mr. Chen's qualifications than celebrating the fact that his grandmother's crops were being saved. "Why does it matter where Mr. Chen learned how to help our plants?" Tommy asked with the directness that children bring to adult complications. "The important thing is that he figured out how to make them healthy again when nobody else could do it." Dr. Kim smiled at Tommy's intervention, but her expression remained professionally curious. "You are absolutely right that results are what matter most," she said gently. "But understanding how Mr. Chen developed this approach could help us teach other farmers to use similar methods when they face crop disease problems." Mrs. Rodriguez had been standing quietly during the technical discussion, but now she spoke with the authority of someone whose family's survival had depended on the success of Marcus's work. "These professors are very impressed with what you have done, Mr. Chen, she said. They keep saying they want to write papers about your methods and share them with other farmers. That sounds like a good thing to me. Marcus looked around at the group of agricultural professionals who were studying his work with obvious respect and interest, and he realized that his attempt to help one family quietly had evolved into something much larger and more public than he had intended. The success of the treatment program was attracting exactly the kind of academic attention he had been trying to avoid since leaving his university position. Dr. Torres approached Marcus with the serious expression of someone who had reached an important conclusion. "Mr. Chen," he said formally, "I would like to invite you to present your findings at the Regional Agricultural Research Conference next month. This kind of innovative approach to integrated disease management needs to be shared with the broader agricultural community." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge that Marcus could no longer avoid. Accepting would require revealing his true credentials and expertise, effectively ending his ability to live quietly as a small-scale farmer. Declining would mean that knowledge that could help other struggling farmers would remain hidden and unused. Janet Morrison had been observing the entire exchange with growing understanding about the complexity of the situation she had discovered. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "I think we all recognize that you possess knowledge and experience that could benefit many farmers beyond Mrs. Rodriguez. Whatever your background might be, your willingness to help this family demonstrates the kind of commitment to agricultural community that we should be supporting rather than questioning." As the afternoon progressed and the university representatives continued their examination of the treated crops, Marcus found himself thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. He had chosen to leave academic life behind because he had grown tired of research that remained trapped in scholarly journals instead of reaching the people who could actually benefit from it. Now he was facing an opportunity to bridge that gap, but only by revealing aspects of his past that he had worked hard to keep private. The growing attention surrounding Marcus's work at the Rodriguez farm had created an unexpected divide within the local farming community. While the university researchers and state agricultural officials were impressed by the results, many of the valley farmers viewed the outside interest with suspicion and resentment. The weekly coffee gathering at Henderson's feed store had become a forum for heated debates about proper farming methods and the wisdom of trusting experimental approaches over time-tested traditions. Marcus became aware of the community tensions when he stopped at the feed store to purchase supplies for his own farm and found himself the subject of pointed stares and whispered conversations. Pete Jenkins approached him near the checkout counter with the aggressive manner of someone who had been building up grievances for several days. "Marcus," Pete said loudly enough for the other customers to hear, "I hear you have got those university people all excited about your miracle treatments over at the Rodriguez place. Some folks are starting to wonder whether you have been honest with us about your background and qualifications." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being cornered by people who had already made up their minds about him. He set down the bag of fertilizer he had been carrying and faced Pete with as much calm as he could manage under the circumstances. "Pete," Marcus said quietly, "I have never claimed to be anything other than a farmer who was willing to help a neighbor in trouble. The treatments I used are based on sound agricultural principles, and they appear to be working." Bill Jenkins joined his brother near the checkout counter, and Marcus realized that the confrontation had been planned rather than spontaneous. Other customers had stopped their shopping to listen, and Marcus could see both hostility and curiosity in their faces. Bill shook his head with the disappointed expression of someone who felt personally betrayed. "Marcus, we welcomed you into this community when you bought your farm 5 years ago. We treated you as one of us, and now it turns out you have been hiding some kind of fancy education that makes the rest of us look like ignorant country folks." Marcus looked around at the faces of people he had considered neighbors and friends, and he realized that his attempt to help the Rodriguez family had created consequences he had not anticipated. His success had somehow become a threat to others, as if his knowledge diminished their own worth and experience. "What part of this story resonates most with you?" Marcus thought to himself, remembering how often he had seen fear and insecurity masquerade as anger when people felt their expertise or authority was being challenged. Share your thoughts about times when helping others has created unexpected complications in your own life. "I understand that some of you feel deceived," Marcus said to the group that had gathered around him. "That was never my intention. When Mrs. Rodriguez needed help with her crops, I offered what assistance I could provide. I did not think about how that might affect relationships within the farming community. A woman Marcus recognized as the wife of another local farmer spoke up from near the seed display. "Mr. Chen," she said with the careful politeness that often preceded difficult questions, "my husband says those university professors are claiming your methods could revolutionize how we deal with crop diseases. If that is true, why have you been keeping that knowledge to yourself instead of sharing it with farmers who have been struggling with similar problems?" The question hung in the air with an accusatory weight that Marcus found difficult to answer honestly. The truth was that he had been keeping his knowledge to himself because he had wanted to escape the professional obligations and expectations that came with his academic credentials. He had chosen the quiet life of a small farmer specifically to avoid the kind of attention and responsibility he was now facing. Before Marcus could formulate a response, the feed store door opened and Tommy Rodriguez entered with the determined stride of someone on an important mission. The boy looked around at the group of adults and immediately understood that Mr. Chen was being confronted by people who were unhappy with him. Tommy walked directly to Marcus and stood beside him with the fierce loyalty that had characterized all of their interactions. "Mr. Chen," he said clearly, "Grandmother sent me to tell you that the university professors want to take soil samples from 3 more sections of our farm. They say your treatments have worked better than anything they have seen in 20 years of research." Pete Jenkins looked down at Tommy with obvious irritation. "Son, this is an adult conversation about farming practices that you do not understand. You should run along home and let the grown-ups discuss these matters." Tommy looked up at Pete with the startling directness that children sometimes display when confronted with adult condescension. "Mr. Jenkins," he said calmly, "I understand that you told everyone our crops could not be saved and that Mr. Chen was wasting his time trying to help us. But our plants are healthy now, and your plants still have the same diseases they had a month ago." The accuracy of Tommy's observation created an uncomfortable silence in the feed store. Several of the farmers present had indeed been dealing with crop disease problems of their own, and none of them had achieved the kind of dramatic recovery that was visible at the Rodriguez farm. Bill Jenkins's face reddened with embarrassment and anger. "That boy has no business talking to adults that way," he said to Marcus. "You should teach him some respect instead of encouraging him to be disrespectful to his elders." Marcus felt his own anger beginning to rise at the way Tommy was being treated, but before he could respond, the boy spoke again with remarkable composure for someone his age. "Mr. Jenkins," Tommy said politely, "I am not trying to be disrespectful. I am trying to understand why you are angry with Mr. Chen for helping my grandmother when nobody else was willing to help us. It seems like you should be asking him to help your crops too instead of complaining about the help he gave to ours." The simple logic of Tommy's question exposed the fundamental irrationality of the community's response to Marcus's success, and Marcus could see several of the gathered farmers beginning to look uncomfortable with the position they had taken. The irony of the situation became apparent within a week of the confrontation at Henderson's feed store. The same fungal disease that had devastated the Rodriguez crops began appearing in fields throughout the valley, including the farms owned by the Jenkins brothers and several other families who had been most vocal in their criticism of Marcus's unconventional treatment methods. What had initially seemed like an isolated problem affecting one struggling family had revealed itself to be the leading edge of a regional agricultural crisis. Marcus first became aware of the spreading disease when Janet Morrison called him at home on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying the strain of someone dealing with an emergency that was rapidly expanding beyond manageable proportions. "Mr. Chen," she said without preamble, "we have confirmed cases of the same fungal infection on at least 12 farms in your valley, and preliminary reports suggest it may be spreading to adjacent counties as well." Marcus felt a familiar sinking sensation as he recognized the implications of what Morrison was telling him. A disease outbreak of this scope could devastate the regional agricultural economy and destroy the livelihoods of hundreds of farming families. The treatments he had developed for the Rodriguez farm had been effective on a small scale, but scaling up to address a county-wide crisis would require resources and coordination that went well beyond his capabilities as an individual farmer. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to Marcus's farm, beginning with Bill Jenkins, who arrived shortly after dawn looking haggard and desperate. The confident hostility that had characterized his recent interactions with Marcus had been replaced by the humble desperation of someone facing the loss of everything he had worked to build. "Marcus," Bill said as he approached the farmhouse where Marcus was having coffee with Lily before school, "I need to apologize for the way I talked to you at the feed store last week. My corn is showing the same symptoms that the Rodriguez family had, and I am hoping you might be willing to help me the way you helped them." Marcus looked at the man who had publicly questioned his qualifications and accused him of deceiving the community, and felt no satisfaction at seeing his former critic brought low by circumstances. The disease did not discriminate between those who had supported Marcus and those who had opposed him, and failing crops were a tragedy regardless of the political positions of their owners. "Of course I will help, Bill," Marcus said simply. "Bring me soil samples from the affected areas and I will analyze what we are dealing with. The treatment protocol may need to be modified depending on how long the infection has been developing in your fields." Throughout the day, other farmers arrived at Marcus's door with similar requests for assistance. Pete Jenkins came in the afternoon, followed by 3 families from the eastern part of the valley, all carrying soil samples and wearing the expressions of people who had run out of other options. Each visitor offered the same mixture of apology and desperation, acknowledging that they had been wrong to criticize Marcus while begging for his help in saving their crops. By evening, Marcus's kitchen table was covered with soil samples, plant specimens, and hastily drawn maps of affected fields. Lily helped him organize the materials while asking thoughtful questions about plant diseases and the scientific methods he was using to analyze them. She had become fascinated by the agricultural chemistry involved in his work, and Marcus found himself explaining complex biological concepts in terms simple enough for an 80-year-old to understand. The scope of the crisis became fully apparent when Dr. Sarah Kim arrived from the State University with a team of graduate students and a truck full of laboratory equipment. She had been monitoring the disease spread through official channels, and her expression was grim as she reviewed the preliminary data with Marcus. "Mr. Chen," she said as they examined soil samples under portable microscopes, "we are looking at the worst agricultural disease outbreak this region has seen in decades. The fungal pathogen appears to be a particularly aggressive strain that has developed resistance to most conventional treatments. Without effective intervention, we could see crop losses exceeding 50% across multiple counties." Marcus studied the microscopic images of the fungal structures, noting characteristics that confirmed his worst fears about the virulence and adaptability of the pathogen they were facing. The organism showed signs of genetic variation that suggested it was evolving rapidly in response to environmental pressures, which meant that any treatment approach would need to be both comprehensive and adaptable. Dr. Kim continued her briefing with the systematic approach of someone trained to analyze complex agricultural emergencies. "The State Agricultural Department has asked me to coordinate the scientific response to this outbreak," she said. "Given your success with the Rodriguez farm and your apparent expertise in integrated disease management, I would like to formally request your assistance as a consulting specialist." Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Accepting Dr. Kim's request would require him to reveal his academic credentials and take on the kind of high-profile professional role he had been avoiding since leaving the university. Declining would mean that his knowledge and experience would remain unavailable to the hundreds of farming families who desperately needed help. Before he could respond to Dr. Kim's request, Tommy Rodriguez appeared at the kitchen door with his grandmother close behind him. Mrs. Rodriguez carried a basket of vegetables from her recovered garden, and both of them wore expressions of gratitude mixed with concern about the crisis affecting their neighbors. "Mr. Chen," Tommy said with the serious demeanor he had developed since becoming involved in agricultural problem-solving, "Grandmother says we should help the other farmers the same way you helped us. She says when people are in trouble, you do not worry about whether they were nice to you before. You just help them because that is the right thing to do." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded her agreement with her grandson's assessment. "Mr. Chen," she said in her careful English, "you saved our farm when everyone else told us it was hopeless. Now all these other families need the same kind of help. If you know how to save their crops too, then I think you should do it, no matter what happened before." Marcus looked around his kitchen at the soil samples and plant specimens that represented the hopes and fears of dozens of farming families, and at the faces of people who were depending on him to provide solutions to problems that could destroy their way of life. The comfortable anonymity he had maintained for 5 years was no longer an option. The emergency meeting convened at the county courthouse drew the largest gathering of farmers, agricultural officials, and university researchers that the valley had seen in decades. Marcus arrived with Lily at his side, carrying a folder of treatment protocols and soil analysis reports that represented weeks of intensive work analyzing the spreading disease outbreak. Dr. Kim had requested that he present his findings to the assembled group, and Marcus knew that this presentation would effectively end his ability to remain anonymous within the agricultural community. County Commissioner Janet Walsh called the meeting to order with the grave demeanor of someone dealing with a potential economic disaster. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we are facing an agricultural crisis that threatens the viability of farming throughout this region. Dr. Kim from the State University will present the scientific assessment, followed by Mr. Marcus Chen, who has developed what appears to be the most effective treatment approach we have seen so far." Dr. Kim's presentation outlined the scope and severity of the outbreak using maps, charts, and microscopic images that painted a sobering picture of the challenge they were facing. The fungal pathogen had now been confirmed on over 40 farms across 3 counties, with new cases appearing daily despite efforts to contain the spread. Conventional treatment methods had proven largely ineffective, and the economic impact was already approaching millions of dollars in lost crops. When Dr. Kim finished her presentation, she introduced Marcus with words that made his academic background impossible to continue hiding. "Mr. Chen brings a unique combination of practical farming experience and advanced research expertise to this crisis," she said. "His innovative treatment protocols have achieved remarkable success where conventional approaches have failed." Marcus stood up slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes focused on him with varying degrees of hope, skepticism, and curiosity. Many of the farmers in the audience had known him for 5 years as a quiet neighbor who kept to himself and ran a modest operation. Now they were about to learn that their assumptions about his background and qualifications had been completely wrong. "Thank you for the opportunity to share what I have learned about this disease outbreak," Marcus began, his voice carrying the professional authority that he had not used in public since leaving his university position. "Based on extensive soil and plant tissue analysis, we are dealing with a highly adaptive fungal pathogen that has developed resistance to standard fungicide treatments through a process of rapid genetic mutation." The technical language and scientific precision of his presentation caused a visible shift in the attention and posture of his audience. Farmers who had dismissed him as an amateur were now leaning forward to catch every word, while agricultural officials were taking careful notes about treatment protocols they had never encountered before. Marcus continued his presentation with the systematic approach of someone trained to communicate complex research findings to professional audiences. The organism shows characteristics of both Fusarium and Phytophthora species, suggesting either a hybrid pathogen or a previously unknown variant that has emerged under specific environmental conditions. Effective treatment requires a multi-phase approach that addresses both the immediate symptoms and the underlying soil conditions that allow the pathogen to thrive. He moved to the easel that had been set up for visual aids and began sketching diagrams that illustrated the biological mechanisms underlying his treatment approach. The room was completely silent except for the sound of pens moving across paper as people tried to capture the information he was providing. Phase 1 involves the application of specific organic acids that alter soil pH in a targeted range that inhibits fungal reproduction while promoting beneficial bacteria populations, Marcus explained, his presentation growing more confident as he settled into the familiar rhythm of academic instruction. Phase 2 introduces selected mycorrhizal fungi that compete with the pathogen for resources while forming symbiotic relationships with crop plants that enhance their natural disease resistance. Bill Jenkins, who was sitting in the front row, raised his hand with the hesitant manner of someone who was still adjusting to seeing Marcus in this new role. "Mr. Chen," he said carefully, "this level of scientific knowledge suggests training and experience that goes well beyond typical farming background. Could you tell us about your educational qualifications?" Marcus paused, knowing that his answer would fundamentally change how the community saw him and understanding that there was no longer any way to avoid the revelation he had been postponing for years. "I have a doctorate in agricultural science from Cornell University," he said simply. I spent 15 years as a professor and researcher specializing in sustainable disease management before I moved to this valley to focus on practical farming applications. The silence that followed his revelation was profound and lasted for several long seconds as the audience processed the implications of what they had just learned. The quiet farmer they had known for 5 years was actually one of the leading experts in exactly the kind of agricultural crisis they were now facing. Dr. Torres, who had been observing from the back of the room, was the first to break the silence. "Dr. Chen," he said with obvious respect, "your research publications on integrated pest management were foundational reading in my graduate program. I had no idea you were living and farming in this region." Mrs. Rodriguez, who was sitting with Tommy near the middle of the room, stood up with the dignity of someone who wanted to make an important point. She looked around at the assembled farmers and officials before speaking with the authority of someone whose family had been saved by Marcus's expertise. "All of you are surprised to learn about Mr. Chen's education," she said clearly. "But Tommy and I have known for weeks that he possessed special knowledge about plant diseases. What impressed us was not his degrees or his research, but his willingness to help our family when everyone else told us our situation was hopeless. His qualifications matter less than his character." Tommy nodded vigorously in agreement with his grandmother's assessment. "Mr. Chen could have told everyone he was a famous professor," he added with the directness that had become his trademark. "But instead he just came to our farm and worked in the dirt with his hands to save our crops. That seems more important than having fancy titles." The comments from the Rodriguez family seemed to release the tension that had built up in the room following Marcus's revelation. Several farmers began asking specific questions about treatment protocols and application methods, while agricultural officials discussed coordination and resource allocation for implementing his approach on a regional scale. The transformation in how the community treated Marcus following his revelation at the county meeting was both dramatic and somewhat overwhelming. Within days of his presentation, his phone began ringing constantly with requests for consultations, interviews with agricultural publications, and invitations to speak at conferences throughout the region. The quiet anonymity he had maintained for 5 years had been replaced by the kind of professional recognition he had deliberately left behind when he moved to the valley. Dr. Kim had organized a coordinated response to the disease outbreak that positioned Marcus as the lead scientific advisor for treatment protocols across the affected region. Teams of university students and extension agents were being trained in his methodology, while specialized equipment and organic materials were being shipped in from suppliers across multiple states. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the local agricultural community had ever experienced. Marcus found himself dividing his time between his own farm, where Lily continued her homeschooling with the addition of advanced lessons in agricultural science, and a temporary laboratory that had been set up in the county extension office. The laboratory allowed him to analyze soil samples and plant specimens from throughout the affected region, fine-tuning treatment protocols based on local variations in soil chemistry and disease progression. The success of the large-scale treatment program became apparent within 2 weeks of implementation. Farms that had been facing total crop loss were showing remarkable recovery, with new growth appearing in fields that agricultural officials had written off as beyond salvation. The Jenkins brothers, who had been among Marcus's most vocal critics, were now among his most enthusiastic supporters as their own crops responded dramatically to his treatment protocols. Pete Jenkins stopped by Marcus's farm on a Thursday evening to express his gratitude and to apologize more thoroughly for his earlier hostility. "Marcus," he said as they walked together through Marcus's own fields, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said at the courthouse meeting. I let my pride and my fear of looking ignorant make me hostile towards someone who was trying to help our community." Marcus listened to Pete's apology with the same patient attention he brought to all difficult conversations, understanding that the man's earlier anger had been driven by insecurity rather than malice. "Pete," he said quietly, "you were protecting your family's livelihood and your community's traditional ways of doing things. Those are not bad instincts, even when they lead to misunderstandings. If this story of agricultural transformation touched your heart," Marcus thought to himself as he considered how profoundly the crisis had changed relationships throughout the valley, "let us know where you're listening from and how communities in your area handle challenges that require expertise from unexpected sources." The broader implications of Marcus's work were becoming apparent as reports of the successful treatment program reached agricultural researchers and policy makers at state and federal levels. Dr. Kim had submitted preliminary findings to several academic journals, while the state agricultural department was developing new guidelines based on Marcus's integrated approach to disease management. More personally meaningful to Marcus was the impact his revelation had on his relationship with his neighbors and his sense of belonging in the farming community. The suspicion and resentment that had initially greeted his expertise had given way to respect and gratitude, but also to a new kind of expectation that he would continue to serve as a resource for the region's agricultural challenges. Mrs. Rodriguez visited Marcus's farm on a Saturday afternoon, bringing fresh vegetables from her fully recovered garden and carrying herself with the pride of someone whose faith in a friend had been vindicated. She found Marcus and Lily working together in their greenhouse, where they were experimenting with new disease-resistant plant varieties that could help prevent future outbreaks. "Mr. Chen," Mrs. Rodriguez said as she watched father and daughter collaborating on their research, "Tommy and I have been talking about what happened over these past months. We realized that you could have told everyone about your education and your research experience from the very beginning, but you chose to help us quietly without asking for recognition or credit." Marcus looked up from the seedlings he was examining, noting the way Lily was carefully recording observations in her notebook with the same systematic approach he had tried to model for her. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said thoughtfully, "I moved to this valley because I wanted to focus on practical applications of agricultural science rather than academic research. Helping your family gave me the opportunity to use my knowledge in exactly the way I had hoped to when I left the university." Tommy appeared from behind the greenhouse, where he had been helping Marcus's neighbor repair a section of fence, and joined the conversation with the serious demeanor he had maintained since becoming involved in agricultural problem-solving. "Mr. Chen," he said with characteristic directness, "are you going to keep living here and farming like before, or are you going back to being a professor now that everyone knows about your education?" The question touched on something Marcus had been considering since the county meeting. Several universities had already contacted him about research positions, while agricultural companies were offering consulting contracts that would provide substantial financial rewards for his expertise. The success of his disease treatment program had reopened professional doors that he had deliberately closed when he chose the life of a small-scale farmer. Lily looked up from her notebook with the concerned expression she wore when she sensed that important decisions were being made. "Daddy," she said quietly, "you told me we moved here because you wanted to help farmers by working with them instead of just writing papers about farming. Does that mean we should stay here even if people want to give you fancy jobs somewhere else?" Marcus felt the familiar tension between professional opportunity and personal values that had shaped many of the major decisions in his life. The difference now was that his choice would affect not only his own family but also a community that had come to depend on his expertise and guidance. The sound of vehicles approaching the farmhouse interrupted his contemplation. Dr. Kim was arriving with what appeared to be a delegation of officials from the state agricultural department, and Marcus could see from their formal attire and serious expressions that they were bringing news of significant importance to the future of his work and his role in the agricultural community. Dr. Kim emerged from her vehicle accompanied by two individuals whose official bearing and formal attire immediately signaled the importance of their visit. The woman introduced herself as Director Patricia Hayes from the United States Department of Agriculture, while the man was Regional Agricultural Commissioner James Mitchell. Their presence at Marcus's modest farm represented a level of federal attention that no one in the valley had anticipated when the crisis began. Director Hayes approached Marcus with the respectful demeanor of someone who had reviewed his academic credentials and understood the significance of his recent work. "Dr. Chen," she said formally, "I have come to personally thank you for your extraordinary response to this agricultural emergency. Your innovative treatment protocols have not only saved millions of dollars in crop losses within this region, but have also provided a model for disease management that could benefit farmers nationwide." Marcus felt the weight of federal recognition settling on his shoulders as he invited the delegation into his farmhouse. Lily retreated to her room with her schoolbooks, sensing that the adults needed privacy for important conversations, while Mrs. Rodriguez and Tommy remained in the living room with obvious curiosity about the high-level attention Marcus was receiving. Commissioner Mitchell opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across Marcus's kitchen table. "Dr. Chen," he said with the systematic approach of someone presenting an official proposal, the USDA would like to offer you the position of National Director of Innovative Agricultural Research, based in Washington but with authority to establish field research stations wherever you believe they would be most effective. The offer was more prestigious and well compensated than anything Marcus had been offered during his academic career, representing recognition at the highest levels of agricultural policy and research. Director Hayes elaborated on the scope of the position, explaining that he would have resources to implement his integrated disease management approach on a national scale while training extension agents and agricultural researchers across the country. Dr. Kim watched Marcus's reaction with interest, clearly understanding the magnitude of the opportunity being presented. "Marcus," she said quietly, "this position would allow you to reach thousands of farmers instead of dozens. Your research could influence agricultural policy at levels where real change happens for farming communities nationwide." Before Marcus could respond to the federal offer, Tommy spoke up with the directness that had characterized all of his interventions in adult conversations. "Mr. Chen," he said seriously, "if you take that job in Washington, who will help the farmers here when they have problems? Will there be someone else who knows as much as you do about making sick plants healthy again?" The question cut directly to the heart of Marcus's dilemma about how to use his expertise most effectively. The federal position offered the opportunity to influence agricultural policy on a massive scale, but it would remove him from the direct, hands-on work with individual farmers that had given him the greatest satisfaction during his career. Mrs. Rodriguez adjusted her position in her chair and looked directly at the federal officials with the dignity of someone who had something important to contribute to the discussion. "Director Hayes," she said carefully, "I understand that you want Mr. Chen to work for the government because he saved our crops when nobody else could help us. But I think you should know that he did not save our farm because of his fancy education or his research experience. He saved our farm because he cared about helping people and was willing to work with his hands in the dirt until he found solutions." Director Hayes listened to Mrs. Rodriguez with polite attention, but Marcus could see that she viewed the elderly woman's comments as touching but irrelevant to the serious business of agricultural policy. Commissioner Mitchell maintained a professional smile while clearly expecting Marcus to accept an offer that represented the pinnacle of success in his field. Marcus looked around his kitchen at the soil samples and plant specimens that still covered most of his workspace, evidence of ongoing projects with local farmers who continued to seek his guidance on various agricultural challenges. Through the window, he could see Lily's garden plot where she was experimenting with companion planting techniques, and beyond that the fields where he grew the vegetables that supplied several local families with fresh produce. "Director Hayes," Marcus said finally, "I am honored by the confidence you have shown in my work and grateful for the opportunity you are offering. However, I need to consider whether the most effective use of my expertise is in Washington developing policy, or here in the Valley working directly with farmers to implement practical solutions." Commissioner Mitchell leaned forward with the earnest expression of someone making a final persuasive argument. "Dr. Chen," he said, with respect, "you could help thousands of farmers from a position of national authority. Staying here limits your impact to a small regional community when your knowledge could benefit the entire agricultural sector." Tommy looked back and forth between Marcus and the federal officials with growing understanding of the stakes involved in the decision. "Mr. Chen," he said quietly, "when you first came to help grandmother, you did not ask her to move to your farm so you could help her better. You came to our farm because that was where the problem was and where the help was needed." The simple logic of Tommy's observation illuminated the fundamental issue that Marcus had been struggling to articulate. The federal position offered prestige and influence, but it would separate him from the direct contact with soil, plants, and farming families that had made his work meaningful. His most effective contributions had come not from developing policies in offices, but from working alongside farmers in their fields to solve specific problems as they arose. Dr. Kim had been observing the conversation with growing understanding of Marcus's perspective. "Marcus," she said thoughtfully, "what if there was a way to maintain your connection to practical farming while still sharing your expertise more broadly? The university has been discussing the possibility of establishing a regional research and education center that would allow you to work directly with farmers while training extension agents and graduate students in your methodologies." The suggestion offered a potential middle ground that Marcus had not previously considered, a way to expand the reach of his work without abandoning the Hansen approach that had proven most effective. He could continue living and farming in the valley while serving as a resource for the broader agricultural community through research, education, and direct technical assistance programs. 6 months after the federal officials had visited his farm with their prestigious offer, Marcus stood in the newly constructed greenhouse that served as the centerpiece of the Valley Agricultural Research and Education Center. The facility had been built on land donated by the county, with funding from a combination of state grants, university partnerships, and contributions from farming families whose crops had been saved by his innovative treatments. Through the glass walls, he could see fields where dozens of farmers were participating in research trials for sustainable disease management techniques. The decision to decline the Washington position had surprised many people in the agricultural establishment, but it had felt absolutely right to Marcus as soon as he had announced it. Director Hayes had been gracious in her disappointment, acknowledging that his choice to remain connected to practical farming represented a valid approach to advancing agricultural science. The Regional Research Center had proven to be an even more effective platform for sharing his expertise than the federal position would have been. Lily had adapted to her father's increased prominence with the resilience that children often show when their families undergo significant changes. She now attended the local elementary school but spent her afternoons at the research center, where she had become an unofficial assistant to graduate students and visiting researchers. Her natural curiosity about plant biology had blossomed under the mentorship of university scientists who were delighted to work with such an engaged young learner. Tommy Rodriguez had become one of the center's most dedicated student volunteers, spending every weekend learning advanced agricultural techniques and helping with research projects. His grandmother had recovered not only her crops but also her financial stability, as the successful harvest had allowed her to pay off accumulated debts and invest in improvements to her farm infrastructure. The transformation extended throughout the valley community, where the crisis had fundamentally changed relationships between farmers and created new networks of cooperation and knowledge sharing. The Jenkins brothers had become enthusiastic advocates for sustainable farming practices, while Henderson's feed store had expanded to include a technical library and meeting space where farmers gathered weekly to discuss innovations in disease management and soil health. Dr. Kim visited the research center regularly in her role as university liaison, coordinating graduate student research projects and helping to publish findings in academic journals that reached agricultural scientists worldwide. The work being done in the valley was gaining international recognition as a model for community-based agricultural research that bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. On this particular morning, Marcus was preparing for a delegation of agricultural officials from 3 other states who wanted to learn about establishing similar research centers in their own regions. The success of the Valley program had attracted attention from farming communities across the country that were dealing with their own disease outbreaks and sustainability challenges. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived at the research center carrying a basket of vegetables from her thriving garden, accompanied by Tommy, who was excited to show the visiting officials around the facility. The elderly woman had become something of a local celebrity as the farmer whose crisis had led to the discovery of Marcus's expertise, and she wore her role with the dignity of someone who understood the historical significance of recent events. Mr. Chen, Mrs. Rodriguez said as she unpacked fresh tomatoes and peppers for the center's community lunch program, "Tommy has been telling me about the farmers from other states who are coming to learn from what we have built here. It makes me proud to think that our troubles led to something that could help so many other farming families." Marcus accepted the vegetables with gratitude, noting the perfect health and exceptional size of the produce that reflected the ongoing success of his soil management techniques. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said warmly, "none of this would have existed without your willingness to trust a neighbor who offered to help. Your faith in the possibility of solutions made everything else possible." The visiting delegation arrived promptly at the scheduled time, and Marcus spent the morning giving them a comprehensive tour of the research facilities, demonstration plots, and community education programs that had developed over the past months. The visitors were particularly impressed by the integration of advanced scientific research with practical farmer training, and by the way university students worked alongside local farmers as equal partners in the learning process. During the afternoon question and answer session, one of the visiting officials asked Marcus about his decision to decline the federal position in favor of remaining in the valley. "Dr. Chen," the official said, "do you ever regret choosing regional impact over national influence, especially when you see how many farmers could benefit from your expertise on a larger scale?" Marcus considered the question while looking out at the demonstration fields where local farmers were working alongside graduate students to test new varieties of disease-resistant crops. The simple answer was that he had never been more satisfied with his professional work or more confident that he was using his knowledge in the most effective way possible. Every approach to agricultural research involves trade-offs between scale and depth, Marcus replied thoughtfully. Working at the national level allows you to influence policy and reach large numbers of people, but it can distance you from the specific challenges that individual farmers face in their particular soil and climate conditions. Here, we can develop solutions that are both scientifically rigorous and immediately practical for the people who need them. Tommy, who had been listening to the discussion with the serious attention he brought to all matters involving agriculture, raised his hand to add his perspective to the conversation. The visiting officials looked surprised to be addressed by a 10-year-old, but they listened respectfully as he spoke. "Before Mr. Chen came to help my grandmother," Tommy said with characteristic directness, "lots of important people told us there was nothing they could do to save our crops. But Mr. Chen came to our farm and got his hands dirty and figured out how to make our plants healthy again. I think the difference is that he cares more about helping people than about being important." The truth of Tommy's observation resonated through the room with the clarity that children sometimes bring to complex adult situations. Marcus felt a familiar sense of gratitude for the path that had led him from academic research to practical problem-solving, and for the community of farmers, students, and researchers who had created something unprecedented in the valley. As the visiting delegation prepared to leave, carrying plans for establishing similar research centers in their own regions, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun when a desperate boy had appeared at his farm asking for help. The crisis that had threatened to destroy the valley's agricultural economy had instead become the foundation for innovations that were now spreading to farming communities across the country, proving that sometimes the most important discoveries emerge not from laboratories but from neighbors helping neighbors solve problems together.